Hello and welcome to Dig Deeper, Bible Enrichment Studies for Individuals and Small Groups. My name is John Rollison. I am the pastor at Journey of Life Lutheran Church in the Lake Nona area of Orlando, Florida, and I want to welcome you to this edition of Dig Deeper. These studies get published every week in order to give people a deeper look into whatever the text is for that Sunday's sermon, because sermons tend to be lighter and more application oriented, but I want to give people a chance to dig deeper. So there you go. Without further ado, let's move forward. This week's text is a particular incident that happened with Jesus. It's called Transfiguration of Jesus, and it's recorded in Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 36. So I want to start by reading that for you. And then we'll pause for a moment for questions, because we offer these for use in small groups as well as individuals, and the small groups like to have the discussion questions. So, first of all, the account of the Transfiguration of Jesus. Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 36. Now, about 8 days after these things, he took with him Peter, James, and John, and went up to the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it's good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. As he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud, saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. So that's the reading, and here's the opening question. How do you see your parents differently now compared to how you thought of them growing up? And we'll take a 5-second pause. If you're doing this in a discussion group, pause the video, and I'll see you in 5 seconds. All right, so on to the actual Bible study. And I'm going to try and keep this tight. We try and keep these 30 minutes or less. Last week's went 40. I was doing it in my car, and so it got a little loosey-goosey. We'll try and keep it tighter today. So here we go. This episode of the Transfiguration is found in very, very similar form in all 3 synoptic Gospels. And the synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they appear to all come from the same viewpoint. John writes from a very different viewpoint. In fact, he even kind of plays around with time, in terms of placing different incidents in Jesus' life in an order to make a theological point about Jesus. But all 3 synoptic Gospels show this episode, and pretty much in the same form exactly. This is one of 5, at least what some people recognize as major milestones in Jesus' life. Starts with his baptism, transfiguration, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension. Now, I think that I would want to add at least his incarnation in there also, but that wasn't in the commentary I read. So there we go. One of the things that's unusual about this, as opposed to other miraculous events that surround Jesus, is that this one actually happens to him instead of from him to others, like healing the sick or casting out demons or things like that. This is something that happens to Jesus. So that makes it kind of unique. Of course, the resurrection also happens to Jesus. To get some context, let's look at what has immediately preceded this account of the Transfiguration. So if we look back up in chapter 9 of Luke a little bit, what we see is an episode where Jesus says, "Who do the crowd say that I am?" And they say, "Well, Moses, Elijah, or I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but it was the Elijah or the prophet." And but what happens is Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ of God." And the Christ, that's a Greek word that means anointed one. So Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, and then Jesus foretells his death and his resurrection. And then he says that we are to take up our cross and follow Jesus. And just, it's always important to remember the cross is an instrument of death in this culture. It's not a heavy burden. Now we use it as carrying our burdens, which is a form of dying to ourself. But the first image of a cross is execution, not the carrying of a burden. So when we look at Jesus saying that, we want to bear that in mind. So in all three Gospels, we have this little order kind of leading into the Transfiguration. So first of all, Peter says Jesus is the Christ, and then Jesus answers for them, what is Christ really? Because they had all these expectations about the Christ coming to, throw the Romans out of the promised land and things like that. And so Jesus says the Christ is going to suffer and die and rise again. He's the dying and rising one, not the one they think. And so then the question becomes, okay, so if the Christ isn't, if the Christ isn't what we thought, but the dying and rising one, then what do we do? And then Jesus says, take up your cross and follow him. Follow him into the dying and rising. And that's, it's giving me little goosebumps even just thinking about that. But it's a whole nother study, and so I don't really want to take the time to go very far into that because we want to keep moving. So this is today's mistake. I was supposed to wait till this point to read the account of the Transfiguration before going back to the verse-by-verse study, and instead I read it earlier. But you still have it, so I'm going to keep moving on. Now we're going to go back and do the verse-by-verse study. We start at Luke 9, verse 28. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, the ones that we just said in context, about the Christ and dying and rising, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John and went up on the mountain to pray. There is some speculation about which mountain this is, and different people have different opinions, and it doesn't really do anything for us as people to know which mountain it is. Now, 8 days. This is an interesting little variation because Matthew and Mark, those other two synoptics, both say 6 days after. And I don't know what to make of that exactly. 8 days there's an interesting coincidence there. Baby boys in Jewish culture are circumcised on the 8th day. And why would that be on the 8th day? And some scholars speculate that it has to do with an idea of new creation. Because remember, creation took 7 days, right? There was day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then on the 7th day, God rested. So the 8th day is the new creation. And so 8 days after talking about dying and rising, Jesus goes up onto the mountain, and that sort of shows a new creation kind of thing. Just like baby boys are circumcised on the 8th day, marking them part of God's new people. So that's the 8 days thing. Now, Peter, James, and John. This is interesting a little bit. Jesus appears to have sort of an inner circle of people, maybe more trusted, maybe their closest friends. And you and I, we have... most of us anyways don't draw our circles of friends like definitely and intentionally, but we all have a group of people at groups of people at different levels, right? I mean, there's some people who are just like tight and they just kind of get us and we get them, And that works. I got 2 or 3 friends like that, and I swear we could not talk for 10 years, and the moment we're talking, we're just like right back there. And you probably are blessed with a few friendships like that too. And so there's the people that we really, really click with, and then there's people that are good friends, but they don't quite get us the same way. So I don't know what to make of Peter, James, and John, but they're definitely are welcomed into a closer circle with Jesus, into some of his most intimate moments. The Transfiguration is, of course, a very intimate one. They were the 3 that got to witness the raising of Jairus' daughter in Mark chapter 5, verse 37. And Peter, James, and John were also the ones who stayed close to Jesus when he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, as recorded in Mark 14:37. Interestingly enough, they also fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane too. But there definitely they are the close ones. So, a mountain. He goes up on a mountain to pray, and mountains historically have been places of the revelation of God. And we're going to take a somewhat closer look at that when we get down to Moses and Elijah in a few verses here. So this event of the Transfiguration, it doesn't stand in isolation here. Peter mentions it 40 years later when he writes this letter, 1 Peter. We're going to read that. And John also writes something that might be alluding to the Transfiguration right in the middle of his gospel account, which was written even later than 1 Peter. So the piece where Peter describes it goes like this. He's writing to the believers, and he says, "We did not follow clearly devised myths when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." So it's really hard not to go off on tangents, but we are encountering this very thing today about saying, well, Jesus is a good myth, and here Peter already addresses it within a letter that has been preserved as part of the canon of Scripture, that it's not a cleverly devised myth. He is an eyewitness of his majesty, continuing at verse 17 in 2 Peter 1. "For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by majestic glory, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased.'" Verse 18, and this is the key one for this particular study. "We ourselves heard this very voice born from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain." And so you see right there, it's the idea that this is a historical happening. The account of Jesus is a historical happening. And that changes the way we look at it and changes the way we think about how it works in our lives. So there's that one from 2 Peter. And then let's jump down to John, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14. John writes, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." And this is a little more subtle, but he says we have seen his glory, and that might be a reference to this particular incident where they get to glimpse the glorified Son of God standing there with Moses and Elijah. And grace and truth is a whole nother subject that I would love to go off on, but I'm not going to. But those are the 3 ingredients for spiritual growth are grace, truth, and time. And we need all 3. You got to have grace in your life, because otherwise you can't face yourself to grow. You got to have truth in your life and people who tell you the truth. Otherwise you might not face the truth, and then it just takes time. So anyway, that's an aside. Moving on to Luke chapter 9, verse 29, the next verse in our text. "As he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white." So here we have Jesus' appearance was changed, but he was still recognizable. There are other times when his appearance is changed and he's kept from being recognizable. A main one would be on the road to Damascus with the 2 disciples when he walks along with them and talks about the Old Testament, and how the Christ had to suffer and die, and then they beg him to stay, and so he stays with them for the evening, and then they sit down to a meal together, and he breaks the bread, and then they recognize him, and then he disappears, and they jump up and run back to Jerusalem to tell everybody they have seen Jesus alive. And there are other post-resurrection appearances where it is not immediately apparent that it's Jesus until Jesus chooses to be recognized. In this case, his appearance is altered, but he is still clearly recognizable as Jesus. There's a big point to be made here, and it ties in a couple of verses that we're going to get to as well. What are we witnessing here when we see the appearance of his face change and his clothing become dazzling white? This is glorified Jesus, but what part of Jesus are we witnessing? And the truth, I think, is that what we're really witnessing is his glorified humanity. As we read the text, we find Moses and Elijah are also shown in glory, and here Jesus is shown in glory. And so, of course, Jesus is the Son of God, but what we're witnessing here is the glorification of his human nature, the human Jesus in body. So really, what we're seeing with Moses and Elijah and Jesus is not just the future of Jesus, but the future of ourselves. 1 Corinthians 15:51 is a verse where Paul talks about the idea that we're all going to be changed. He says, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed." And then John writes something similar, although it's a little stronger, because, okay, so here we have seen the glorified Jesus and glorified Moses and glorified Elijah. So we're already knowing that this is the future of humans, not just Jesus as the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. And that's what John says here in 1 John 3, verse 2. He says, "Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is." And I really think this is a reference to the Transfiguration. We are already God's children, but what we are going to be like hasn't been revealed yet, hasn't appeared. But we're going to see Jesus as he is fully, and when we do, we will be like him. He was changed there in front of them, and we too will be changed, and we will be like him. What does that mean? If there's not a question at the end of this Bible study about what does that mean, and how does that affect the way we look at ourselves and live our lives, make sure you talk about that if you're in a small group, because that is huge. It's worth thinking about. It's hugely worth thinking about. All right, moving on to the next couple of verses. Luke chapter 9, verses 30 to 31. "And behold, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem." So the word there for departure is exodus, which literally means the road out. And he's talking with Moses and Elijah. Interesting to think about how Peter, James, and John knew it was Moses and Elijah. There is something about heaven, and when heaven breaks into our earthly realm, that knowledge is granted that just bubbles into our brains somehow. I don't know. But they knew it was Moses and Elijah. And so they were speaking with Jesus about his exodus, the road out that he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And of course, Exodus is a huge word. If you say Exodus, you can't help but think, well, I don't know, maybe you think of Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments, but the Exodus has a primal place in Western culture, really, the idea of going out. And Exodus is a road out of slavery, it's a road out of bondage, it's a road out of all that stuff. But the road out of slavery is the road into the promised lands, because when you leave the slave land, of course the Israelites had to go through the wilderness, but part of the point of leaving the slave land was entering the promised land, right? And so Jesus is getting ready to do a personal exodus. He's going to be leaving the broken land of the earth and returning to the land flowing with milk and honey on an eternal heavenly scale. And other apostles speak of their death at the same with the same kind of metaphor. Peter writes about that in 2 Peter 1 verse 5. He says, I will make every effort so that after my departure you may be able at any time to recall these things. And he's talking about his death there, I think, too. And it's the same thing. He knows that he's about to have an exodus. And it's exodus underneath there, too. So let's go back and take a look, a little bit deeper look at Moses and Elijah here. I want to pull out an entry from the New Bible Dictionary and just take a look at that with you. It says here, there are many features of the account of the Transfiguration which derive significance from the Old Testament. And here we get a few. Moses and Elijah represent the law and the prophets, witnessing to the Messiah and being fulfilled and superseded by him. Each of them had a vision of the glory of God on a mountain. Moses on Mount Sinai and Elijah on Mount Horeb. And each of them left no known grave. And of course, Jesus left no grave because he was resurrected. The law of Moses and the coming of Elijah are also mentioned together in the last verses of the Old Testament in Malachi. So the law, that's Moses, where he met God on Mount Sinai and was given the law. And Elijah was on a cave in Mount Horeb where God revealed himself to him. And you might recall that he was not in the wind, he was not in the fire. And then Elijah heard a still small voice. And that was God's revelation to him. So these two people basically represent the Old Testament, really. And the fact that they are talking to him indicates that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, because the people who are the Old Testament are there talking to Jesus. Let's look at some of these verses here. We're going to look at that Malachi chapter 4, verses 4 to 6, that mentions the law of Moses and the coming of Elijah as part of messianic expectation. Malachi chapter 4, verses 4 to 5. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And so that's Moses and Elijah mentioned right at the end of the Old Testament as the things to hold in mind as we wait for the Messiah. And Jesus said it is these scriptures that testify about him, even though not everybody saw that. In the Gospel according to John, in John chapter 5, verse 39, Jesus says this, "You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me." And so Jesus was pointing to the scriptures and saying they point to him. And here on the Mount of the Transfiguration, we have the personification of the scriptures, being Moses and Elijah talking to Jesus. Now, we'll move back to our main text again. Luke chapter 9, verse 32. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep, but when they came fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just a couple things here. One is Jesus must have been able to pray for a long time. Imagine going up on a mountain to go sit with somebody who can meditate comfortably for like 3 or 4 hours, and 5 minutes is your limit. That's kind of probably what's going on with Peter, James, and John, is that Jesus is he's in a totally different category, even just as a human. And whenever he goes like to seriously pray, sooner or later they just get tired and they fall asleep. Because you recall they fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane also. And also note that this is really something that's actually happening, which is what we read earlier too. It's not just a vision that Peter sees, because all three of them see it, and that wouldn't be the way visions happen. Just like the resurrection appearances aren't just visions that people have where they think they see Jesus or some sort of manifestation of grief, because the resurrection appearances involve multiple people at the same time, up to 500 at one time. And so here, Peter and the others all see this as they wake up. So it's really happening. Next verse, Luke chapter 9, verse 33. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it's good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. Not knowing what he said. Some people are quiet when they're not quite sure what needs to be said, and some people, if they're not sure what needs to be said, they're just going to say something. And that's Peter. Luke obviously here reports that Peter didn't really know what he was saying. I don't know if you've ever been scared or startled or amazed and said something, or nervous maybe, and said something that when you look back on it later isn't really the thing that you would have said if you could have had more time to think about it. I think most people have experienced that, and lots of people experience it when they meet their heroes or celebrities. They kind of get tongue-tied, right? So that's kind of what's going on here. Some people look at Peter's suggestion here and think of the tabernacles of the Feast of Booths, or tabernacles, also called Sukkot, which is a 7-day annual feast in which Israelites lived in temporary dwellings. And they do this to commemorate God's provision during their time of deliverance from slavery as they wandered in the wilderness before they entered the promised land. They remember that they are sojourners. Personally, I think that's a little bit of a stretch. I think Jesus is saying, this is cool, let's stay here longer. I'll go get some branches and start building some tabernacles. But anyway, you can talk about that if you want to. Luke chapter 9, verse 34. As he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. God's presence is often made visible to people as a cloud, and I think that being afraid in God's presence is a very reasonable thing. If we look at the Old Testament, we see that, for instance, he led the Israelites through the desert as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And then let me pull a couple other Exodus verses up for you that talk about the presence of God as a cloud. Exodus 24, verse 16, talks about the glory of the Lord dwelling on Mount Sinai as a cloud. It says this, "The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day he," that is God, "called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud." And then later on, they've got the tabernacle. It's the tent of meeting. It's the temporary thing before the temple is built. And the cloud also symbolizes God's presence for the Israelites there. Exodus chapter 40, verse 34. "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." So the presence of the Creator, the Father, is shown in a way that we can see it, makes itself known by the presence of a cloud. And then, of course, we know it's not just a normal cloud because of the next verse. Luke chapter 9, verse 35. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." So this is very close. What the voice of God says about Jesus here is very close to all the baptismal accounts, where we hear the voice of God saying, "This is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased," for some of them. There's a little manuscript variant here. Some of the manuscripts of Luke 9:35 have "my beloved" instead of "my chosen one." I'm not sure what to make of that. Matthew, in this instance, adds the phrase, "in whom I am well pleased." But all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they report what happened here, they include the phrase, "listen to him." And that is not part of what happens at the baptism. That's what happens now. Just to take you quickly back to the baptism, we'll use the Lucan recollection of the baptism. It's in Luke chapter 3, verses 21 to 22. He says, Luke writes, "When all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized and was praying, the heavens were opened, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, 'You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased.'" So there's the baptismal. That's kind of the way it comes down in all three of the baptismal accounts. But there's no "listen to him." Now, just to take that back to Messianic prophecy for a moment, I'm going to pull you back to the book of Isaiah, chapter 42, verse 1, which reads, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations." And so that talks about the Messiah, the chosen one, being the one in whom he delights. And that's the one who's going to bring forth justice. And we know that Jesus actually bore justice on his own body, the justice of our sin, so that we could know that we are free from that and we are at peace with God through Jesus Christ. The last verse, Luke chapter 9, verse 36. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. The question is, why didn't they tell anyone? And the answer is, it's likely that Jesus asked them not to, because he had already asked them not to tell people that he was the Christ. Let me take you back to the context real quick. Remember, Peter, after Jesus said, "Who do other people say that I am?" And then he said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ of God." And then in Luke chapter 9, verse 21, this is Jesus. He strictly charged and commanded them to Luke. There's a typo in my slide. I see what happened. Luke 9, verse 21. And it reads this: "And he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one." So he told his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. And then he continued by foretelling his death and telling them they needed to take up their cross. So likely, Jesus said, don't tell anybody. We've made it through all the verses of this account, and now we have a slide of small group questions, which I'm going to read for you, so that if you're just listening to this, you can hear them, and maybe they'll give you a point of reflection. So number one, is there an event in your life you wish could have lasted longer, days even, maybe forever? Number two, what do you think the disciples felt when they woke up from their drowsiness to this scene? Number three, Peter evidently thought it would be good to prolong the experience. Have you ever had something that you think of as a mountaintop kind of spiritual experience, like a great moment of comfort or awakening or peace or joy, something like that? Number four, what do you think would happen if you tried to hang on to a mountaintop experience? Number five, how might the transfiguration of Jesus change the way you walk into your life each day? And remember what we talked about, how the appearance of Jesus in glory is really the future appearance according to his humanity, because Moses and Elijah also appear in glory. And the New Testament talks about us all being changed. And John even says, we will be like Jesus. So how does that change the way you walk into your life each day? And of course, the final one, the one I always end with, what else struck you? Thanks for going through the account of the Transfiguration with me. I am John Rallison, the pastor at Journey of Life Lutheran Church in Orlando, Florida. You have been listening to or watching Dig Deeper, our Bible enrichment studies for individuals and small groups, based on the text from the sermon for the previous Sunday. Love to have you visit our website, www.journeyoflife.org. Love to have you come and worship with us in person. Love to meet you. So go to our website and find out where we're currently meeting and what time. And if you are so inclined to financially support our ministry, that would be helpful for us and a sign that our ministry is of value to you. And you can do that via our website also. So thank you so much for listening, and God bless you.